Hello, guys, and welcome back to the new series of the Figuring Things Out podcast with me, Will Brown, with the topic of practice. Today's guest is Bren Veziroglou. I hope I said his name correctly. Bren is an old friend, and we dive into a ton of amazing stuff. In this 3-hour episode, yes, 3 hours, we dive into his past, his family history, his training inspirations, his childhood, through to his experience with the Ido Portal method, the movement culture, and his current research on ecological dynamics. The first half of the conversation is very much about Bren, who he is, his background, and his experiences. And the last half of the conversation is all about ecological dynamics, this new and exciting learning framework. This is a gold mine. There is a lot of amazing value, both for people that are at the top level of sharing and teaching in the culture, and also people that are simply interested in what is a personal practice and how I can better learn as an individual. Tons of value. Very excited about this one. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go with Brett. So, man, the last time I saw you, I think was in London, right? Like it was in the Terrace Anime, 1 to 2 week intensive. I feel like your life's been pretty crazy since then.
Yeah. What year was that? Was that 2022?
2 maybe, or 3. I think 2. 2 would make sense. I went to a couple. I think I went both in 22 and 23. And you were there maybe in the initial one
Yes.
when Tina was
Actually, I
present,
think
maybe.
I think the second one. Because I think I remember when I was there, you had been there the previous year.
That could be the truth then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it was 23.
Yeah.
Or maybe I went 21, 22 and you
Yes.
came in 22.
That makes for
Yeah. Sweet. And you've been diving into a whole host of everything else since then.
Yeah, I mean, I've been always trying to fucking do stuff, But
Yeah, I feel it. I feel it.
I feel
Like so much stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing with, being a movement teacher. It's like, where that's the meta is the jack of all trades to some extent. And that's been really interesting. I was talking to Joseph Fruchek, who and he was talking about it where I assume that he, I think of him as a generalist as well. He sees himself as a specialist in communication. And communication.
Because he's a PhD in communication,
Yes.
though.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so his thing is like embodied communication, and his kind of thesis seemed to be that you can't just train the voice by just training the voice, like you have to embody the different scenarios and all these different things. And then that specialization now spreads out, because now you can attack that in all these different areas.
Right. The deeper down the rabbit hole he goes, it always seems to branch out eventually, or the depth becomes the breadth at one point or another.
Yeah. That was
for the listeners at home. This is one half of Fighting Monkey Practice, Joseph Fruchek and Linda. Yeah, very interesting guy. I had a private with him with a group in Athens when they were based in Athens a few years ago, and he was talking a lot about his PhD and his thoughts there, and I think it lends itself really nicely into, I guess, what you've been studying the last couple of years. Like it's, I have a lot of questions on this topic. I feel like I would like to set the scene a bit better for the listeners before we dive into the depths. I also, for my own curiosity, I don't know you so well pre-movement culture. I think we know each other through training and in the internet and obviously the physicality. But I'd like to know a bit more about Bren, like the history, where you come from, like what's the background before the physicality, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You're American through and through?
You could say that. I was born in the US, so like I'm American. But then, it's interesting, like no one looks at me and like, yeah, you're American, right? Everyone's like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, San Jose. And they're like, well, where's your family from?
I look at you and I see like a Belarusian Olympic weightlifter. Like you have the stature of an old school jacked Belarusian weightlifter, When I first met you, I was like, damn, who the hell is this guy?
That is a great compliment. I'm gonna take that one to the grave.
You
That's good.
should, you should.
But
I'm
but
jealous.
yeah, so my dad's Turkish and my mom's Portuguese. Um,
Gotcha.
so mom was born in the U.S. Her parents immigrated, and then my dad, um, he came from Cyprus, so they're on the Turkish side of a
Mm.
small island in the Mediterranean. And my dad was like the it's funny because I never heard it from him, but what other people say is that he was like the smartest guy on the island, you know. And there are
Cool.
some, in some of these European countries, they have like the high school exit exam, and like that determines
Mm.
everything, like which college you go
Right.
to, and so they ranked it, and he was like, I think he was number one, and so he got to like choose wherever he could go, but then they were too poor, so they couldn't afford a lot of places that my dad wanted to
Mm.
go. So they actually went to the UK and like continued high school there. He did like a high school continuing thing, and then got a scholarship to come to MIT in the US. And then that's where he
Gotcha.
met my mom, and then they both moved to the Bay Area,
Mm.
and then I
The
grew
rest
up.
is history.
Yeah, I grew up there. So
Yeah. Sick. And am I right in thinking your mum's from the Azores? I think we had
yes,
a
yes.
conversation.
So
Yeah.
well, so she was uh born in the US, but her parents are from San Miguel.
Mm.
So
Great.
yeah,
So I've just been living there the last 6, 7 months, and it's absolutely beautiful. For me, it's a real shame for me, if I can say this, because there's a big hole in the culture. So they have lots of young people up until like end of school age, like 18, 19, 20, maybe not even that old. Or they have people with kids and older. And people from 20 to kind of 35 leave for better opportunity.
uh,
And for me, living there, I was like, oh man, this is an unbelievably beautiful place. There is so much vastness in the nature. People are super warm, super friendly, but there's not that life for the age that I am right now.
right.
Did your mom have that? Is that one of the reasons why she left, or were the parents already
Yeah,
emigrating?
the parents already left, so she grew up
Okay.
in Dartmouth, Massachusetts.
Mm.
Um, but I think back then, when my grandparents were in the Azores, it's just, it's like economically, there's really not that much going on, So
I think whale hunting back then was the main industry, like legit. Um, everyone, at least part time, was a whale hunter. Like if there's a whale sighting, everyone's just jumping out from the classroom. Okay, we've got to jump in the boats.
it's funny. I'll have to ask about that. That's
You
because I
should,
bet
eh?
there'll be some
It's
good
huge.
stories.
Yeah, man. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's some really amazing whaling museums on the islands,
Oh
and
wow.
I say amazing. It's obviously a dark
Sure, but
history
interesting,
in a
right?
sense. Yeah, yeah, really much so. Like very physical, very dangerous. Yet everyone did it for their livelihoods, and it was. We saw like some amazing artwork from that, like people etching into the tooths, like the most intricate, like not paintings, like sketches almost on this. I believe it's ivory, the
Yeah.
teeth, and yeah, incredible stuff.
Oh.
Um, so you grew up in San Jose, and then you went to uni also in California.
No, so yeah, to back up a little bit. So basically, I grew up basically my dad's in tech, right? The
Hmm.
tech companies in the Bay Area. It's like a hot spot. And in a way that's a backdrop in a bit. So I grew up and my parents, that my dad did well for himself. So my parents put me in all sorts of sports as a kid, because that's what you do, right? You put, okay,
Mm.
that's a well-rounded education. You need to learn how to swim, and you need to play soccer or try playing soccer, and like have diversity and these different things. So I did those for
Yeah.
a while, and probably, I mean, I was not that good as a kid. I remember not really playing much of the games, but I wasn't terrible, and I
Mm.
I definitely enjoyed them. And then in middle school, I started playing StarCraft. And I was like, dude, This all these outdoor things, like, these are kind of lame. These video games are pretty cool. So
Yeah,
that was
definitely.
all, and I just kind of like laser focus on certain things. So for me, that became like, oh yeah, I got to do
Mm.
this. Yeah, I got to level up my character, like get better at this. And
Was that the drive, do you think? Like the gamification, if you can say that, of like the clarity of positive feedback of like you can judge how good you're getting?
yeah, definitely.
Uh,
Definitely. And at that time, I had no experience with really being good at sports or feeling the capability to become good at sports. Like, I'd never really
mm,
seen improvement. Certainly, I'm sure I had improved, but relative to other people, it was never like I never noticed I was catching up to people. And usually I would, people were kind of getting better faster than I was. So, and again, when you're that young, like, you just don't really think about these things that much. Like, I just never thought about really the extent to which, like, oh, if I could get better if I practice more, or like, how would that happen,
mm,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, like, exactly like you're
Hindsight's
saying.
bliss.
I think, in these games they make it very clear, right? You have, upgrades that you do, and it's a certain level. You see the level on the screen, right? It's very clear.
Mm,
And yeah, that's very addictive. That's what, games are built for. They're built to be addictive and
yeah,
fun to play. So, 2, 3 years later, suddenly I'm extremely unathletic, like, very little movement intelligence, very not flexible, very skinny. So in high school, first semester, freshman year, I was 5'3", 101 pounds, like a
wow.
stick. And
Yeah, yeah.
but in high school, I decided I wanted to play football. I really wanted to play football. So I started playing, and there was this kid on the team that he was like the coach's son, so he would like throw me around, and he would just do whatever he wanted. And I was okay. I'm when I want to do something, I'm pretty determined, so
Mm.
I wasn't ever gonna stop. But it
The
was,
laser focus came back.
yeah, but it was always there. It was just in a different direction,
Mm,
right?
mm, mm.
And I wonder if part of that came from a cultural thing with my parents, that they never really saw physical activity as like really. I think for them and for most people, physical activity and sports are just like a support for you to like kind of be healthy. But the real
Mm.
thing is like your career and your job and school,
Right,
right?
right.
So
Mm.
so there was no like importance of that side for me. So playing football, getting bullied, and after the first semester, after the season ends, I say to myself, man, like, I don't feel that I have any autonomy as far as that I can control what happens to me on the field. Like, I'm that bad,
Mm.
right? Like, I felt like I was so skinny and weak that like this guy can do whatever he wants to me, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? I had no
Mm.
concept of like skill and martial arts, or any of that side yet. But again, that's the culture, right? Is you build the strength and the muscle, and now you're strong and powerful, right? so,
Mm.
so I started lifting a
For sure.
lot.
Yeah.
And so I started lifting 3 hours every day. Every day the gym was open, I was there three
Oh,
hours.
wow.
And I do like some long rest intervals, but like hard sets. And it turns out
This is how old? In middle school still? Like 14 years
high
old?
school.
High
So
school.
so middle school was all StarCraft. And then high school I
Mm, mm,
started
mm.
football.
Gotcha.
And so there's a concept from the book The Sports Gene. I don't know if you've read it. Very good book,
Of course.
where they've got, genetics as broadly, you could be low baseline and low responder. So like, if you don't train, how muscular are you? How fast are you, right? And then once you start training, how well do you respond to that training? And the idea is,
Mm-hmm.
the Olympians are like high baseline, high responder. And, you can have any combination.
Mhm.
So I was definitely low baseline for strength and muscle mass and most of that stuff, but I was
Obviously a high responder.
very much a high responder. So I put on 30 pounds of muscle in my first year of lifting, you know?
Oh, talk about newbie gains. Oh my God.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so it
Okay.
was to the point, apparently, I heard years later that some of the other parents of kids on the football team, like they had come up to my mom. They'd be like, "Hey, I think your son is taking steroids. Like, do you know your son is
Wow.
taking
Okay.
steroids?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "No."
He's not. He's not.
Because she's
He was just 4 years deep in StarCraft and then
yeah, yeah,
changed his
yeah,
focus.
exactly. Yeah, what a dramatic shift. And,
Yeah.
she she'd pick me up from 3 hours at the gym every day, so
Yeah, exactly.
it's
Yeah.
like,
She saw the evidence.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So at that age, how were you educated into like training methods, programming, planning that, or were you just going in there and just messing around?
Pretty much, the coaches had programs. So basically, I wouldn't say I was messing around. I was just doing whatever program the coaches had for us.
Gotcha. Okay.
But yeah, again, I wasn't really conceptualizing training so much at that point. The thought was
Mm.
just do the training, get strong, build muscle, and then I can self-regulate essentially. And so what
Yeah. Yeah.
started to happen, so after that first year of lifting, it's very interesting, as I gained muscle, I didn't gain any skill in self-defense, martial arts yet whatsoever. So in a way, not really much more. Like if you were to actually measure my self-defense skills, let's say,
Yeah.
they wouldn't have changed much. Like even including the physical output.
Mm.
And yet,
Yeah, I think that's a good point actually. It's your relative skill would have
would have
been stagnant.
exactly.
But I think there's a very interesting point there, which I think a lot of newbie trainees have, which is this physical robustness that is like the physicality is intertwined in their emotion. So how you were feeling emotionally initially was vulnerable, maybe. But like you said yourself, this other guy could do whatever he wanted with you, which is not a nice place to feel. Like
No,
that's
yep,
like the worst survival situation you could be in. And then you have this physicality, and yes, you have no improved skill potentially, but you have an emotional situation that allows you to present yourself in a different way, maybe, at least on the football field.
totally.
And I think that baseline stands for something.
Totally. And at the time, I
Yeah.
had no idea that skill mattered, right? I was just
Mm.
like, oh, physical capacity. That's the narrative in football, right? Is like you play the
Yeah.
game and then you lift weights so you're big and strong and muscular and fast. And then you just take those physical
Mm.
capacities and you just insert them into the sport and you get like better performance, right?
Gotcha. Yeah. It's Lego.
Just like that.
We're going to get into that. Don't worry.
Yeah. But basically, as I got more muscular, people stopped wanting to try stuff with me. They stopped wanting to throw me around as much. So,
Mm.
that just kind of decreased over time. But I was still terrible at football. Like I never really played. I was always third string,
There's the skill
basically.
component.
Yeah. Because I never
Yeah.
developed it at all. And I never saw it as
Mm.
valuable. I never knew how to develop it really, other than practicing when everyone else is practicing. But I've also got less movement intelligence because I've been sitting down on a computer screen for 3 years. So
Gotcha.
how would I possibly have progressed faster than other people that are actually in the game more often, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, so
So fast forward your football career, did you get to a point when you were just disenfranchised or kind of disinterested?
not really, no, because I had made a lot of progress weightlifting wise. I'd gone from
Mm.
like very small and weak and one of the weakest people on the football team to significantly faster, one of the strongest people on the team. So that felt like I was making good progress, and it just started to feel like there was a disconnect between
Mm.
the physical capacities and like the actual skill that I was noticing. And then in college, I wanted to study biochemistry. I'd done some research at Stanford in high school, And that was really interesting and fascinating. So I started getting really into science. So I went to Brandeis University on the East Coast. It's a very good school. They have a really good biochemistry program. And I started to slowly see a disconnect. What I wanted to do is connect my research to the things I was learning at school, right? There's like a depth of like, the high school AP chemistry was like here, and, the actual research I'm doing was here. And there's this huge gap of things that are completely unexplained to get to the things I was actually doing. So,
What was it that you were researching?
a number of things, but so we were looking at the heat shock response, basically. So we had glow in the dark mice, transgenic mice. So it was pretty cool. So if you take the gene, the protein that makes fireflies glow, you can take that
Imagine
gene.
if they grew.
Yeah. I mean, there's many, many that make them grow, but as far as I know, only one that makes them glow. Sort of two, but anyway, so you splice that into a gene that you want to study, right? So for us, it was HO1, heme oxygenase 1, and we thought it was a key part of the heat shock response. Basically, long story short, as you say you go in a sauna, right? As you heat things up, your proteins all have a certain shape, right? They're a chain of these amino acids. They fold into these shapes, and the shapes do a lot of the activity. It's when these proteins change shapes or they denature. So that's the word for basically you heat it up. As you heat it up, the molecules are vibrating more and more, and then at a certain point, it starts to lose the shape or the combination of shapes that they had before, and that can become dysfunctional, right? So the proteins can then start to aggregate. And we think that that's a huge mechanism that a lot of neurodegenerative diseases have, where we see these aggregates of proteins in the brain as a hallmark of the disease. So your body has all sorts of like very clever things to not just let that happen, but basically there's other chaperone proteins that come, and so as proteins start to, unfold, misfold, these chaperone proteins will come along. There's these huge protein complexes, and they'll basically encase these other proteins and get them to go back to their proper shapes. There's a huge pathway and cascade of all these different, they call them heat shock proteins. So as you stress the organism with heat, these heat shock proteins are upregulated. We get the heat shock response. And so, that's a very interesting thing for a lot of stuff. So we were looking at a small molecule called Celestrol. I don't know if you've ever heard of the thunder god vine.
Nope.
I've never heard of it in a practical sense other than, from the research, but apparently it was or is a pretty common traditional Chinese medicine that they'll use thunder god vine, the root extract, as an anti-inflammatory. So people have been doing this for, 500 years plus. They've been using this whole, the extract of this root, which has all sorts of different compounds. But we thought the key compound was a small molecule called Celestrol. And it has this big effect on a lot of these heat shock proteins. And then we're also seeing that, at least in mice, it seemed to have a lot of really awesome effects, like anti-cancer effects, Alzheimer effects, like all sorts of really cool and interesting stuff. So basically, we took these transgenic mice that they had a gene for luciferase, so that protein in the fireflies that makes them glow. So whenever they would make HO1, we gave them another copy of HO1 that had luciferase at the end. So now, wherever you see these mice, wherever they make HO1, they'll also make luciferase in the same in the same amount, the same like temporal space, right, at the same time. So, and then we had this really cool thing. This was something that my PI had innovated. That it's going to sound. I'm going to explain it in a way that sounds really lame because it's actually very interesting, and that's the way. Then it makes sense. and this is also, I think, just an very interesting thing in general. So what he did, he had an enormous innovation that he was one of. He's very humble, but with very humble, very successful people, if you hang around them long enough, you'll catch the really cool stuff they do, and they'll try to hide it, But anyway, so one day I'm in his office, and I see there's this plaque there. I think it was new, and I was asking, hey, like, what's that for? He's like, oh yeah, this is for the most successful patents in basically Stanford's history. Because if you patent something at a university, they split the revenue three ways. Like a third goes to you, I think you or your lab. I think you. A third goes to the department, and a third goes to the university. But so that's really good for the university, right? And his patent for this technology that I'm going to describe was like the third most successful, like the third highest revenue in like Stanford's, history.
Wow.
Like this was a big deal. I think it was like, first was Brin and Page from Google, like the creators of Google, like this was a big deal. And so the innovation that created that, all he did was he took just different technologies from different places and he put them together. So if you have, in photography, you have a black box, right? Just a black box is going to shut out all the light. And then you can take a really long exposure picture, right? You keep the shutter open for 30 seconds, a minute, and now it's going to gather a lot more light. So if you have something that's producing a very small amount of light, but you keep the shutter open for a minute or 2 minutes or whatever, now you can see you can sense really small signals of light, right? So he combined that, and then he also took some bacteria that had this, these kind of glow-in-the-dark proteins. And so to test it, he put these like glow-in-the-dark bacteria, essentially, went to, I believe, Safeway, and got a chicken breast. So you glow-in-the-dark bacteria, put the chicken breast on top, put it in a black box, take the camera, long exposure image, and what do you know? You can see the bacteria through the chicken breast. So now you have this tool where you can look at in real time, in real live animals, through the tissues, you can see what they're creating if you give them some sort of, gene, transgenic gene like we did, to make luciferase or make something that glows. You can use all sorts of different proteins that do that.
So the tissue is translucent enough to allow light to...
Yeah, there's some light that goes through it, right?
Yeah.
And so if you have something that's created a very small amount of light, but you put it in a black box, you hold that shutter open, now you can see it. And now what you had to do before, if you wanted to study things like this, you had to euthanize the animals at every time point. So if you give them, a drug and you want to see how does it affect your certain protein, you want to see it 2 hours, 4 hours, 24 hours. You have to have a whole batch of animals. You euthanize them at 2 hours. You do it again. You euthanize them at 4 hours. You euthanize them at 24. Like that's tough. That's expensive. It's hard. And now you can do that. You can have the animals alive the whole time. You just put them to sleep, right? You give them a little bit of anesthetic, and then you give them a little bit of luciferin. So it's another protein that will come in and cleave the luciferase, essentially like allow it to glow. And now you can see it at 2 hours. And then on the same animal, you can see it again at whatever other time point you want. Gotcha. So this is a huge innovation that now you can apply to many different animal models. You can apply it to almost any different protein you want, right? So this is why, and it's so much better than euthanizing these animals and doing the slice. Essentially, like imagine you would slice it, and then you do stains on the different slices, so you could see, okay, you do something that would bind to whatever molecule on this whole slab, and then you could see, okay, it's localized here, and it's about this much.
Yeah.
So that's what.
Wow. So why are you now not a biologist? Where's the jump?
So I was doing a lot of that, and I was doing some protein X-ray crystallography, where you study, you you crystallize a protein. I started this a year or two after, as I was in college. You crystallize a protein, so you get the proteins to all arrange in a pattern, and you shoot a really high energy X-ray at it, and it diffracts, right? Because the thing is, if you want to see the structure of a protein, light the wavelength of visible light is too long. It is physically not possible. There's no sort of microscope you could design to see stuff like that. So you have to do crazy stuff, like you shoot an X-ray at a crystal structure, and because this crystal structure has a pattern, it diffracts, and then you look at the pattern of the diffraction, and you can use some crazy math like a Fourier transform to come back to the structure. And then we can learn again about the structure of these proteins, which is very important. So I'm doing all that stuff, and I'm learning, in college, different classes of like how biochemistry works. And I'm just starting to see like that gap that was there. I got like a little closer, but then I started realizing my sophomore year, I realized, dude, no one's closed that gap. That gap is enormous. We just don't know. We cannot explain this stuff yet. Like we have simulated models of like you take a protein and a small molecule and you simulate how they should bind. And you take into account all this crazy stuff like quantum mechanics and tunneling, not just like where the electrons are and the shape of the molecules. And we still struggle to model the binding of just two molecules, right? When the reality is we've got 20,000 plus different proteins, all in different shapes, and they're all interacting not with one other thing, but each other, in all these different tissues, right? Like that's the complexity of the real system. We can't even model two of those yet, right? Not accurately. Right. So a huge gap there. And as I'm starting to see that, I also started finding the work of Ido Portal. And I started seeing how he's talking about movement rather than fitness. And that starts to make a lot of sense to me. It really starts to put the football in context. Oh, that's why I was struggling, right? Gotcha. And I started reading a lot of, paleo books, Rob Wolf, and all that different stuff, and how they're suggesting that essentially, lower, high carb diets and modern, standard American diets, all these things can be causing a lot of disease because there's this evolutionary mismatch, right? We've evolved for a certain environmental situation, and then the situation we're living in is vastly different. We're eating different foods, we're doing different things on a daily basis. We used to walk 6 to 10 miles every day just to gather food. Even now we're barely getting 2. We used to be chewing like 6-8 hours a day. Now we're getting far less. There's so many different big huge differences that it makes a lot of sense that this evolutionary mismatch is a big deal and is causing, if not exacerbating, a lot of these modern diseases, these cancer, heart disease, all these things that are very complex problems to try to solve from a reductionist biochemical perspective. When we approach it from the whole system, we can do a lot more. We can know we have some effect at a minimum.
Yes. Maybe you can explain the mismatch in better terms. We've had it on the podcast a few times before, at least from the perspective of Lieberman, in the sense of you have a kind of evolutionary XY curve where you just have like the human organism over time slowly adapting to the environment, but it's kind of constant depending on the demands. And then you have this kind of evolutionary pressure from technology and modern invention, adaptation, technological evolution. And this is what he calls more of an E curve, which is a rapidly
Exponential curve.
accelerating curve. Yeah, exponential curve. And then you have this kind of crossover of these two graphs where you have the XY being very consistent and constrained to biological evolution. And then you have technological evolution, or cultural evolution, as he calls it, which is super quick and accelerating faster and faster with time. And he says that right now we've kind of flipped the graphs where evolution was always above the technological or cultural adaptations, and now we're finding that actually culture and technology is affecting us far quicker at a much stronger rate than our kind of genetic evolution or biological evolution. Is that how you understand it?
I mean, let's be clear. Lieberman is much more of an expert on that than I am. Like he's the guy, right? But
He's the guy.
yeah, basically, yeah, that's pretty much my understanding that technology innovations happen so fast. I mean, and they're awesome, right? Like humanity is ingenious.
Look at us right now.
Yeah, right. I mean, AI right now is like, dude, over the next few years, how many things will change? Who knows? Like, all we know is things are going to change, right? And they're changing very quickly. And that's really been what's been happening, especially if you look at, our diet. That's changed rapidly and drastically over the last, 150 plus years. And, that's not in the evolutionary scale, that is the tiniest sliver of time. So we're still evolving. We're evolving faster than we were, probably because there's this huge mismatch now. But it's
maybe the interesting thing there is in such a short space of time, the change in diet has caused a drastic effect. It's like the effect outweighs the time, if that makes sense. Like the result of that time frame is more than you'd expect from that time frame of change.
Could you explain that a little more? What do you exactly?
Well, 150 years is nothing in evolutionary terms, right? We've been around for however many hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
In just a tiny speck of time, the way in which we've changed through even post-industrial revolution, through our diets and the industrialization of everything, we now have a huge, drastic global change in health, in disease, etc. It seems like the change in only 150 years-ish far outweighs the weight of that time period in our overall existence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Which is the shocking part for me, I think. It does make me think or hope that it is equally possible to then positively change in a short period of time. If we can negatively change in such a short period of time, then hopefully the adverse is also true, no?
Well, I think genetic evolution is only ever going to happen so fast until we start trying to fuck with it.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure will happen, is already starting to happen. But
do you want it to happen?
I mean, will I be the first to sign up for gene modification? Absolutely not. But like, if I saw really strong evidence that like we could do some stuff. Again, this is the way I think about biochemistry now. Like I'm not like anti-biochemistry, right? That is absolutely great work that people need to be doing. And over time, as we learn more and more and more, these little things keep adding up, and they will get us to breakthroughs here and there,
Definitely.
But it's a longer time scale. And who knows, maybe AI will change that, because now actually AI really presents a way where before that really reductionist approach of like, this protein and this protein, can we even model these two? But AI can start to look at a whole complex system, right? So
right.
Already AI has done an enormous amount for protein folding.
Yeah. I think that's the exciting part of AI for me, is that we no longer have this kind of looking at the hand when we're looking at the moon, or like not seeing the wood for the trees type
Yeah,
idea, to health and well-being. And it's like you have this specialist here and this specialist there, but they don't communicate or they don't overlap in their perspectives. And it's almost like too many contradictory opinions in specialized areas without this acceptance of overlap or overall complexity, or the system, as you said. Yeah, and I really hope there's some sense of tying things together, interweaving perspectives that AI can bring. Because, man, I feel like it's almost too complex for a human brain to fully grasp health.
absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's already happening, because where AI already is excelling is in the breadth of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Like already it's far beyond any single human in the breadth of knowledge it can
Mm,
have and kind of like export. And then it's pretty easy to like prompt things. Okay, combine take take models from engineering and apply it to biology. And because it's already got some of those ideas, like it's extremely good at that stuff. And especially if you combine that with some expert understanding yourself, where you can say, oh, that's a hallucination and that's not quite right. But like that's a starting point. That's when
mm.
really cool things happen. And then also, we iterate another 2-3 years, these AI models get significantly better than they are now. Wow, now we're cooking. So
Yeah, yeah.
the
I really hope that AI keeps the the eye focused on these types of areas that can really push us forward, and doesn't spend too much time kind of watering down the arts and things that are more human in nature, you know?
Yeah, you know what? There's some things I was seeing. I think there was a video I saw. It was like an artist. There was two people. One was an artist, one wasn't, and they both used AI to create art. And I think they didn't use AI, and you see like enormous difference. And then they use AI as well, and you still see there's a big difference. I think that's something we see in general with technological advancement. There's skill is always going to be involved. It just now includes how you can use the technology to augment your,
Yes.
because now
Mm,
if you can make a shitty painting in 5 seconds with AI, like now, if you're an artist, if you're a skilled artist, that's a huge tool, right? Whereas someone like me that
mhm,
has like very little understanding of like what art is, how do I make art, what's good art, like I'm not gonna know how to work with that. Whereas an artist
mhm,
really,
mhm.
they can just use that to like as almost mechanical leverage to like increase their skill.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do wonder, at least now, obviously, the question of, I mean, we're going completely off topic here, but let's just send it for a moment. If an AI is generating a piece of art, how much of that generation comes from what already exists and it just presents it in a slightly new context? And how much of that is kind of uniquely brought forth from this human complexity? Uh, and then the question is, well, is the human complexity actually bringing something new, or are they just bringing two, disparate ideas together and blah, 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 blah? I don't know. I listened to a podcast of Ed Sheeran recently, actually, and he talks a bit about AI, and he's not so fond of it in the context of art. And one of the quotes that I liked from him, which I don't know if I agree with, but I liked it, which was, I don't think I'll ever watch a movie produced by an AI that will make me cry. And he was kind of leaning into yeah. It's
Dude,
me and
that's
my girlfriend had
that's
this conversation.
already that's already
Yeah,
changing fast, bro. That's gonna happen. That's
yeah,
gonna happen in 5 years, I'd bet.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I,
But his point, I think, is what's valuable, which is why um, take away from humans the part that's uniquely valuable, which is the kind of the subjective aspect, the self-consciousness, the interrelatedness of emotion, and all of these things that are hard to map through a computer. Um, and I think there's something valuable for him to say, in the sense of, why take jobs away from like all the strikes in Hollywood, for example, is like AI was seeking to take away all of the extras from Hollywood by just mapping, AI extras and vocal copyright. And, I can type into ChatGPT now, like, make me a song that sounds like Ed Sheeran, and I get something pretty close. Like, these are all sticky conversations. Let's jump ship, because I feel like we're going to spend the next 3 hours just talking about the future of our species. And I want to get into your experience with Ido. So you mentioned that you were in college, you're doing this biochemistry degree, and then you started to find Ido's work. And I know that you spent then a good almost decade training with and around his ideas. Um, what was the first thing that drew you into him?
His speaking, honestly, the combination of how intelligent he is and how good of a speaker he is and his physical capabilities was something I'd never seen before. And that was really cool. That really drew me in. And then that in combination with the value, what I saw as the inherent value of the idea of movement and movement intelligence and being a generalist, being a skilled human mover as opposed to a sports specialist. I mean, to me, that was really fascinating, and then that starts to interlink with taking, instead of like stepping way out of this reductionist isolation approach and into, okay, how does a human being operate, and how do we help human beings just operate better and more skillfully and more effectively? And then if people are moving better and sleeping better and eating better, well, maybe we'll solve some diseases, maybe not, but we'll definitely reduce your risk for all sorts of this stuff dramatically, right? So that's a huge win no matter what.
Do you think that desire to have that generalist level of experience was met in the first few years of your training with him?
There's someone mentioned something to me once about someone that had trained at a very high level in Ido's work. I'll just say Roy, right? Roy is an incredible mover, awesome person, very cool. But someone said something that he's not actually generous, and this is not just speaking to Roy, but to all these people, including myself at the time, that is actually a specialist in the Ido Portal method, right? And that I felt was certainly very accurate to my experience, actually. And so it very much became, I developed some more movement intelligence. Again, it was starting from almost nothing, and then you like apply, full focus and dedication to this thing. But there are a lot of ways. So this starts to bring us into the ecological dynamics, because Ido's one of his core ideas is the 3 I's, right? Isolate, integrate, improvise. And so that's his model. That's a very traditional model of how we build skill, that we isolate an important movement. We drill it, we repeat it, whatever it is, and we integrate it into more of a sport context. And then we take that thing and we improvise, right? And so that's most clearly his approach to dance, where instead of learning dancing, you learn a move. You isolate a move, and these moves are like Lego pieces. You integrate those Lego pieces, those moves, with other moves. And then you take those moves and you improvise how and where you're going to do them. That idea, that core idea, really extracts us away from what I see now as real movement intelligence. So in ecological dynamics, we see it, you're continuously perceiving, acting, and cognizing, right? It's not perception action coupling. It's not like, now perception's happening. Okay, I've perceived the thing. Now I choose a cognitive action. I recall the motor program and I do the movement. And then I perceive again, what happened in the environment. And then I perform an action again. with, like schema theory has like recall schema and response, sensory, basically like memories of what could happen and memories of what you did around that situation during the recall of the motor program, the generalized motor program that you modify a little bit to accurately perform that movement even as the environment is changing. Whereas we're thinking you're continuously perceiving, you're continuously acting, you're continuously cognizing. To understand movement behavior, we need to think of you and your environment as a complex. And actually, it is a completely different model of how movement emerges, that movement emerges through self-organization. So if you look at a flock of birds or a school of fish, what you see, or fireflies, or all sorts of these different systems, any non-equilibrium system can have self-organization. So actually, crystal formation is another great example of self-organization. These proteins or whatever is forming the crystal, they don't have intelligence per se. They're not making conscious decisions. What happens is that the inherent characteristics of those subunits of each protein, each molecule, and their interactions with the other molecules and the environment they're in can form these higher order patterns, right? So a higher order pattern being the crystal formation, being the flocking behavior of birds, being the movement of a school of fish. Like all these things are not driven, they're certainly not driven by the brain of one fish. They're not driven by one fish. They're not driven by any external controller. They're driven by not even driven. It emerges through the interactions of all those subunits. So in that case, the fish or the birds or the molecules. But now for the human body, we think rather than the brain, there's a lot of evidence why we think this, but we basically think that rather than the brain controlling the body as far as, okay, this, the typical way we think about it at a more reductionist level is that the brain is controlling what each motor unit does, right? So we've got the brain, and then that's going to send some motor signals down through the spinal cord. That goes to motor units. Motor units are just motor neurons and the group of muscle fibers they innervate. And so those tell those fibers to contract, right? And the typical idea is the brain is just controlling all of that like a central, like the CEO at a big company, right? But you have to think about the reality is we've got about 450 to 550,000 of those motor units, right? We've got around 200 joints, around 550 mobile degrees of freedom, right? 550 different ways we can move. So imagine you're trying to control a video game character, right? You've got a character, you've got a controller, you're trying to get him to move or do a certain action, but you've got 450,000 minimum different buttons to control 550 different moving parts. That's an intractable problem, right? That's a really tough problem that if the brain is a central executive controller, that's too much complexity.
Right.
That's kind of the most core theoretical idea why we don't think that works. There's all sorts of evidence as well that there's some really cool experiments from a guy, Scott Kelso, that I've been like dying to talk to because he's brilliant. And so the first experiment he did that he showed this in people, basically he had people just move their fingers, right? So that they're just wagging their fingers like this. So it's an anti-phase movement. So one finger is doing, adduction, the other's doing abduction. So they're anti-phase, but they do that to a certain metronome. They're doing it on a beat. So boop, 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 boop. And then you tell them to match the frequency of that as you increase the metronome frequency. But if something happens as they're trying to do that, let it happen. And what happens as you increase the frequency is at a certain point, it switches from antiphase to in phase. And so you can model how that happens, and it has an abrupt switch. So like you increase the frequency, And at a certain frequency, it starts to really switch quickly. But before that, it's not like it's a linear switch across these, as you increase the frequency from 1 hertz to whatever, that it starts shifting. No, it stays the same, stays stable, and then critical frequency, the shift is starting dramatically. There's, I believe this one's called supercritical slowing down, where as you approach the critical frequency, if you disturb the fingers, it takes people longer to get back to the coordination mode they were in. And then also that there's only 2 stable coordination modes here, in phase and anti-phase. And that there's a hormesis effect where after you go through that critical frequency, after they've switched coordination modes, if you now reduce the frequency, they will stay in that second coordination mode because it's more stable. All 4 of those things you can predict from nonlinear dynamics and self-organization, and all 4 of those things you see in real people when they do that. So that was
Is that also valid, or does that stand up in more complex movement? Because I feel like if you add more degrees of freedom, there's more likelihood of things changing.
That's the question. So that was Kelso's first experiment. That was in the early 80s. So this is
on that thought, actually. So I've read things before of runners, for example, running in a group of multiple people. And obviously everyone has their own different leg length and speed, comfort, and tempo. But for whatever reason, after some time, runners sync tempos when they're running in a group. And their cadence becomes almost exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if this is almost like an example of this thing.
Absolutely.
It's something different. It's different organisms rather than within the same organism.
It's a different scale, but it absolutely is, right? So at its real core, what we have here is the world is nonlinear, right? The world is not, it is not 1 + 1 = 2, right? It's not Bren plus Will equals like, we're twice as good, right? And we could be 10 times as good, or we could be 10 times as bad. Right? Like it's not a linear effect where we just add these 2 people together and, so we have, nonlinear things. Small change in input leads to big change in the output, or a big change in input leads to small change in the output. Because these things affect each other, there's circular causality, all sorts of really complex stuff. That gets into the math of nonlinear dynamics, which most people know as chaos theory. And again, at its core, because the world is nonlinear, so many of these things are at their core behave nonlinearly, and hence can be modeled more accurately through these sorts of models. So when we look at something like the behavior of runners, I haven't thought of that at all. I'm not aware of any research on that at all. But how could it not be nonlinear, right? There's all these effects of these different people, but there is a way in which, as you run in a group, you are going to want to stay. Everyone wants to stay together in the group, right? So you're going to have, well, sometimes when it does, then that's when you'll see the group coagulate, right?
But I think that coagulation also comes from this probably like survivorship tendency for efficiency, like energy saving. And a group being intertwined on a cadence is most likely the most efficient mode of transport, as opposed to everyone being a bit asymmetric and kind of bumping into each other and having different speeds. And I wonder on a simple energy consumption level if that's some kind of motivational reason.
I would bet that that's not a huge deal for running because they're not going that fast. I would bet for running it'd be more of a social thing, right? You're running in a group, you want to hang out with the group. Or it's just like, if you're running a huge marathon, it may just be that this group of people really is right around the same level of capability, so they happen to stay together. But then biking...
I feel like the point of what I read was to say that it was a non-conscious...
Yes. You don't have to...
Emergent.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you look at biking, though, now they're going a lot faster. Now wind resistance is significant. Now you're going to have the group build, and that really, they're conserving significant amounts of energy, right? Like the person in front, they generally say is doing, 20 to 30% more work. So it makes a lot of sense to have that big group. And that's what you see in if you watch the Tour de France, it's always these clumps, right? It's clumps, clumps, clumps. And then there's a lot of strategy of like, you've got the extra energy, but if and when do you try to break away and do that extra work because you want to be first, you know? Because what you don't want to, and you want to break away because what you don't want to do is be slightly ahead and the people behind you are drafting. You want to get way ahead and you're doing extra work, but they're not getting the benefit of that, you know? There's all these different systems that behave like that. You know, there's so many very clear examples. Like nonlinear math essentially is like, it's what you need to actually understand real systems because they're nonlinear. And when you try to make linear assumptions about nonlinear systems, that's what we do in like high school physics. And like it's nice on paper because it's clean and easy. But you know what happens when you have the two balls colliding when there's no friction. Okay, we can model with linear systems. When friction's involved, we can't even model those two balls anymore, right? But if we have we use nonlinear analysis, nonlinear math. Now we can actually start to do stuff like that, and much more complicated things. Like this is like rocket science. You know, you bet your ass like things are nonlinear as you start going past the speed of sound, right? Different things change. You know, how do you model that? That's where nonlinear things, turbulence is a really big area where people are trying to dig in and like, how do we model turbulence? And we need chaos theory. We need nonlinear math because that's what turbulence is.
Yeah. So let's apply this back to physical culture, movement culture, and the topic. So one of the main interests I have with this podcast series is to try and offer people at home some insight into some really interesting people's understanding of physical practice, and then look at ways in which that these people sustain it over a lifetime, over a long period of time. Because I feel one of the major issues with people who are observers of physical practice, or they want to have a physical practice that's really meaningful, or they kind of start and they get stuck and they stop again, is this lack of sustained effort, this lack of making this from an extrinsic motivator to something that's just a part of who you are and what you do. And I wonder, obviously, you've said already in the conversation, like innately in who you are as a person, you have a laser focus. And you have this drive when you find something engaging, you have a drive to just dive in headfirst and really soak that up. What is it that stops people from having that headfirst jump, do you think?
Everyone's different, right? Like, I don't think most people should be like me. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think.
Yeah, actually, looking at what you just produced, yeah.
But so that's not even a recommendation. But at a basic level, there's an enormous value in movement and in taking nutrition seriously, taking diet and sleep, and the trifecta, right? Diet, sleep, movement. I think here's one of the things. So I gave a talk about ecological dynamics at a recent conference, which was really exciting.
Congrats.
But also, my favorite talk from that conference was from a woman named Michelle Seeger. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right. And she talked about motivation. And like you're saying, I've also found the same thing, that, motivation, long-term retention, that is the thing. You know, and I said it in my Intro to Movement series years ago, like, dude, if our goal is to build skilled movers, there's no possible way that happens in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. Like, it's just not happening. It's too big of a task. Well, we need people 3 years, 5 years minimum, right? To like even start getting deep into this thing. And when we take that perspective, oh, now motivation and retention. Oh, these are big deals, right? What I saw when I first started working with, personal training and working with corporate clients, I wanted to do body recomposition. And I was like, sure, yeah, I'll help you. People can do a lot for a few months. Like the first 3 months, people can suffer through a lot. But after about 3 months, man, it's a different story. To stay on it. If you look at the statistics of like how many people stay on a diet, how many people that start on a diet at the next year, they usually weigh the same, if not more, right? Like the retention is so low that the effect has been negative, right? This is a huge problem. And so Michelle Seeger, she's been really thinking about this. I think she's written 2 books on it. And she had a really wonderful thesis. So she was saying that the idea that a lot of physicians are pushing is, oh, you need to exercise for your health, right? Health is important. Exercise is important for health. So, if you want to reduce, you come into the doctor, you're like, I want to be healthier, whatever. The doctor says, hey, we want you to lose some weight, and we want you to do it by exercising, right? And so in her presentation, she had it like they're wearing the binoculars. They're looking at the island over there, and they're wearing the binoculars to see it. And the island is weight loss, is like health goals, right? It's far away, but you could get there. And what she's seen in her research is actually the people whose motivation to work out comes from quality of life. Not the long-term things, but the immediate things. So people, when you ask them, why do you work out? And they say, oh, because I feel better when I do it. I have more energy. I can focus better. Or the flip side of that we hear often, I'm sure, of like, I feel terrible when I don't exercise, right? They're exercising for quality of life. They're moving for quality of life. Those are the people that they do significantly better. They have much better long-term retention. And I think that's something, especially for me personally, as I started to understand, oh, here's how this stuff works. And like, here's all these ways that I could improve at this thing. And really, and then a lot of it is just inherently enjoyable. I think in addition to that quality of life thing, I don't think it's really all that engaging and enjoyable to be just working out on the treadmill, or you're just lifting weights just to lift weights. When you have a real physical activity, a real sport, a discipline where skill is involved, and now you've got to choke someone in front of you. They're trying to choke you. You got to choke them. Now you want to be strong. Now there's a real value to working out, right? And one, you're doing it by preventing yourself from being choked and trying to choke the other person. And then also there's a further value that now if I go work out, if I go run, I have better cardio for this thing. When I go dance, then I can do more things, and I can more freely express and feel good.
I want to push back a bit here. I feel like Seeger, this lady, Michelle Seeger, is saying, when someone looks at the island, it's an if-then type situation. If I do this thing, then I'm going to be better. Then I'm going to lose weight. But the example is then, if I'm training BJJ and someone tries to choke me out and I get stronger, then I'll be able to, or my cardio improves, then I'll be able to.
Well, but
I feel one of the values or benefits of accepting rather than an if-then scenario, but I just enjoy this.
Yeah.
This feels good.
Yeah. So
type mentality. It's kind of a bit more palpable and immediate and maybe even honest.
That's her point, really, is like the core of autotelic experience, right? This experience, this grappling, this running, this dancing, this lifting is, as an experience, inherently rewarding. That's her core point. My additional point on top of that is, I think in addition to that, it also adds value to when you do want to work out, that now it gives you, again, not like it still is an if then, but it's not I'm going to lose weight in 3 months. It's when I go train tomorrow, like I might be a little better,
Mm,
right? It's a
yeah,
much
definitely.
closer if then. But
It adds to the motivational pool, let's say.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I like that.
And again, as
I think there's still a lot of value, especially in Gen Pop and like newbie trainers or people that are more sedentary and want to get into something physical. This kind of first level emotional response is really valuable. I heard it before with people doing like cold exposure. And I've seen people that just can't stick to it because they're like, yeah, yeah. So I do it for all of these insert random biological adaptation. And then you have other people that are like, hey, this is great. Why? Oh, it just feels good. And that's enough. That's literally enough to sustain like a lifetime of X
but
practice.
it's not just enough, it's better. That's her argument.
Yes.
There's like we would
Mm.
normally think of that as enough. But actually, if you look at the people
Yes.
that really stick to ice baths or anything that's hard, what you're going to see is generally it's the people that they find inherent enjoyment in it. And and that's the other thing that's very interesting is when you look at people that are legitimately sedentary, they don't even really know the benefits they could feel when they work out because they don't do it. They do it
Yeah.
so little, they can't map to
Mm.
like what that experience would be, how different it would feel to like go
Yeah.
dance.
Or the perspective of engaging with training or a diet or something positive is from a negative place. It's, oh, I need to punish myself. I need to restrict myself for a short term for that, like, if then type scenario again.
Exactly. And so her push is that we should see exercise and movement almost like a nice warm cup of coffee. It's a
Yeah.
treat. It's
Yeah.
for you. It's not like the bitter medicine that you're taking so you'll be healthier later, although you will be healthier later. But it's the treat that you can enjoy and that you'll feel good and have more energy for the rest of the day. And that's the core.
Mm. My perspective on this has come a long way. So when I was young, of course, I would just do stuff because it felt good. And then I would get into kind of intellectualizing physicality, and it became more of a job than a fun side hustle. And then I was like soaking up a lot of the dominant narrative a while back was like David Goggins-esque. You have to suffer to prove yourself. The only way towards enlightenment is through sufferance kind of vibe. And I wonder how that fits into this perspective for you, because I feel like I'm so far away from that now. When I'm working with students, they come to me and they're like, somewhere near that narrative, I have to lean the conversation way more towards genuinely right now, what inspires you? What makes you feel good? What would get you excited to do X right now? And it's only through that kind of path of conversation that we get to something where they're like, I want to do this for a long time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that I've really I've really always kind of pushed back against that Goggins-ish mindset of like when it's terrible for your body, like you're really like when exercise is suffering and when it's break any bones to achieve your goal, you're going to break the bones, right?
Mm.
And it doesn't have to be that way. And actually, even if you wanted to optimize for maximum performance, it's not going to be through that way, right? It's
Mm.
there's if your goal was truly to maximize the performance, there is a level of sacrifice that probably has to happen. Maybe,
Definitely.
but like I mean, even then, like I talked to DeAndre Corbet, who he is now one of the best grapplers in the world. He just won the second biggest prize in the history of grappling. And
Behind Nicky Rod.
yeah, right behind Nicky Rod, right? The million dollar grappler and $100,000 grappler. But
Yeah.
different tournament. So D may very well win CGI coming up. So
Let's see.
You
Yeah.
know, fingers crossed
Although
for
it's
him.
team right now, just to be off topic, it's team, so who
Yes,
knows?
yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I saw it. It's a shame.
Um, yeah. So he was really fascinating because he's training a lot. He's training more than almost anyone else I've seen, and he's also got a full-time job as an engineer. And so I was really, I did a like good long interview with him, and I was trying to dig into like what's his motivation, what's his story, all this. And what he kept saying over and over was he really enjoys grappling. He really enjoys it. It's a treat for him. You know, as hard as it may be, like he goes hard, you know, he's not like in there to. It's interesting because you look at him
Yeah.
and you see someone that doesn't at all look like he's there to have fun. You know, he looks like very serious. He's there to train. He's there to improve. And yet when I talk to him, then he's all the narrative that I think is going on in his head is this is a treat. This is something that he is grateful he gets to do and enjoy.
Yeah.
And when you do that now for 15 years, oh, now you get real good. You know, so maybe
I want to ask. So I think that it's very easy to talk about this type of case study when someone gets good.
Yeah.
Because they get the positive feedback loops.
Yes.
And as you said, when you were doing football at school, when you don't have those same positive feedback loops, you kind of, it's hard to keep pushing forward. Like other aspects of life that have other feedback loops are likely going to take over, and the noise is going to be too loud to make steps forward. And I wonder, let's dive into your ecological dynamics video, because I tried to watch as much as I could before the call. You said some really interesting things, and you also presented this guy called Josh and kind of becoming an elite grappler through this process, which I thought was very interesting. But I want to also make sure that we see this not only from people that do succeed, quote unquote, but also from the lens of people that are, quote unquote, normal.
Yeah.
They just get into training and they want to enjoy training, not because they want to be the best in the world at something. They want to just enjoy the physicality and reap the rewards of the physicality, which is probably 99% of most people, if we're honest, in a lot of fields.
Yeah.
And I think the world over would be better if we had a lot more emphasis on people's normal experience of something, as opposed to the elite competitive nature. Like I absolutely love elite competition. I'm one of the people, probably as you are, like any sport I will watch until the early hours of the morning quite happily. My girlfriend will always catch me like, what are you watching now? What are these two naked men or half-naked men rolling around sweating on the floor? Like, oh, I'm just watching some random grappling video of some guys. And I don't even grapple. I just love to watch physicality in whatever form. You know, I'll be watching darts and I'm out watching how people throw darts. Like, it's just the thing that I find most interesting. But that's aside. So let's go into the video. One of the quotes that I loved, if I can get it right, I wrote a few notes here. You said, I could name many moves, but Josh could do many moves, but not name them.
I could name
And I thought
many
that was a
moves
really
I
interesting quote.
can't do, but Josh could do many
Yes.
moves he can't name.
Tell me, dig into that.
So, yeah, in this traditional approach, we think of it that skill is kind of an output or modulated or mediated by our mental representations. That our understanding of the sport if we're consciously choosing our actions from a cognitive menu every time that perception action loop happens, then how we think about the sport is going to change which of those action decisions we make, which ones we choose, and therefore lead to more skilled behavior. Therefore, we should really educate and lecture our students of like, here's what the situation is. Here's what you should do when they do this. Here's what you should do when they do that. Here's what you should do when they do that. And that's how sport is traditionally taught. But we're thinking, again, perceiving, acting, cognizing continuously, and those action decisions are never made. We're never recalling a program or choosing any of those programs. Hence, what we need to do is educate the body in the embodied context of the sport rather than intellectualize about it. So I had come up intellectualizing and studying all these different moves. Here's the moves I do in this situation. Here's the move I do in that situation, right? These are the best.
Without embodying the situation. You just
I mean, I did embody, I did train too, right? But so for me, traditional jiu-jitsu training, and for everyone, but for me in particular, it was, the three things. It was studying, in this case, instructionals, taking notes, drilling the movements. And I would always try to drill the moves progressively when I was doing that, like to increase the resistance. And then doing the sport, right? Sparring.
Yeah.
So those three, right? Again, it's kind of the isolate, integrate, improvise thing.
Yeah.
Versus Josh and people using this new approach, it is, again, we can study a little, like we can still support that, but if skill isn't being mediated by our understanding, then what we really need to do is experience the task and the environment and all the rich information movement relationships that are going on during that thing, right?
Experience is understanding.
So Josh has almost entirely, I think he's done 1 or 2 drilling sessions at other gyms around the world, but almost all of his practice has been just, here's a task, here's the full resistance of the partner, here's what you're trying to do, ready, go. Here's what you should look at, ready, go. And so he is really embodying that relationship, and even just seeing how things break down, where you lose, where you win. And so he never really learned the names for a lot of the things he was doing, but he would just do them because that's how you win the game. Whereas I was
reminds me of a Bruce Lee quote. I think it's a Bruce Lee quote, like, it punches.
Exactly.
And it's like, he's not thinking about, when in a second I'm going to do this. It comes out, it emerges, as you said so well in the documentary. I want to try and test you a bit. So I feel like you've done a deep dive into BJJ in the context of martial arts with the ecological dynamics, which I think is fascinating. And I think everyone listening to this should go and watch the documentary. But I also want to, like I keep saying, I want to try and bring it back into personal practice, general movement culture, learning maybe without the relational aspect of martial art. Like, martial art's great because you have the external feedback of a partner and the external pressure of a partner. But how does this context or concept allow us to improve our learning in other areas? Like something as quote unquote simple as a handstand? Or does it allow us to use other situations for strength training? What other realms is it relevant, do you feel? Riff off that for a minute and I'll give you some.
So it's relevant in all of them, but to different degrees. One of the reasons I really gravitated towards this for martial arts, one, is there was someone that was doing it already, and two, it's really so ripe for that revolution. The traditional method versus the ecological approach for martial arts, it is wildly more effective. It's not close. Because the environment is so dynamic when you have a partner who's resisting dynamically. When you take that partner out, things get a lot less dynamic and chaotic, and the relative value of ecological dynamics versus like just drilling the move, they come closer. There's still, I think the ecological approach is a more accurate understanding of what's actually going on, which we can use in different ways. But it's not, again, in jiu-jitsu, it's very dramatic. But it also allows us to work on different things that with the traditional approach, we could not address, right? So we wouldn't even think about these things. So if we think about rhythm...
Let's very quickly, let's just make sure we define traditional approach versus ecological dynamics. I realize we've completely flown by that, and I feel bad.
No, it's fine.
Because before I prepared for this conversation, I too would have been like, what the hell is he talking about right now? Please give us a definition.
So a traditional approach is where coaches either consciously consciously are operating on the assumption or unconsciously working with the assumption that we internalize motor programs through repetitions, that we learn and install movement through repetition, and then the game becomes, okay, drill the thing and then integrate it into the sport, and and then progressively add stress essentially to the programs that we've learned, right? So usually in the research we call that explicit instruction or prescriptive instruction. So explicit instruction, you tell people exactly what to do. Prescriptive instruction is like you're prescribing a drug, right? It's like first do this movement, then do this movement, then do this movement, and like voila, success. So I prefer the word traditional approach because it kind of more broadly captures really what coaches are generally doing. It's a traditional approach. People are doing it, versus the ecological approach is based on this understanding that movement is an emergent property, not something that's stored. And therefore that we really need to think about the performer-environment complex as the fundamental unit of analysis. That movement behavior emerges from the interacting constraints of the individual, the task, and the environment. Hence, we predominantly want to work with tasks where we're playing with those different constraints. And so now all these different areas that are really interesting outside of martial arts, now the game becomes, how can we create these tasks? And what's really cool, the awesome thing, I had a short video on this, I call it the next revolution in movement, just very briefly putting it out there, that the research on the CLA is showing even when we test people on a very narrow skill, people are doing better when they use tasks. But the reality, so people will do better when they do tasks and do all sorts of different stuff around a certain area than when they drill those sort of movements repetitively. And then you test them on how accurately can you now hit a target, right? Something that narrow, where that really doesn't capture the skillful approach, the change in like the education of attention and intention dynamically that we're really trying to do with the ecological approach. So with the CLA, with the ecological approach, we can get better learning specifically, and we can get better transfer because we're not even doing that one specific thing. Of course, we're going to get better transfer to a wider variety of things when we're doing a wider variety of things. For movers, this is the holy grail that we've been looking for, right? Because for us,
it's the breadth and the depth in one.
It's all about transfer for us. And to get depth too, woo, jackpot, right? So
let's go to an example. And I feel like you did a nice example in the video itself. You showed precision jumping and kind of learning to jump to an edge with two different methods. So traditionally, you'd have these kind of internal cues of lifting the knees and landing on the balls of the feet and swinging the arms and so on and so forth. And they're kind of positional, almost like self-awareness style feedback loops. And then on the comparative scale, with the ecological dynamics type constraints-led approach, you had people jumping from different positions, and you didn't prescribe anything other than start here, finish there. Figure out whatever you want throughout the process. And through that process, people would learn, well, tell me what you found.
Yeah, so what you find when you do stuff like that, very broadly, very anecdotally at this point, because again, there's research in a lot of different sports, but as far as I know, there isn't any on like parkour specifically, or a lot of contact improv, a lot of other areas, dance, a lot of other areas that I think we're both interested in. But what you start to see, if movements are emergent properties, the jump isn't something that's stored. It's something that emerges as you try to achieve an outcome. You try to go from here to there without touching the floor in between. Then we can train that capacity as a way to serve that goal. And we can modify the constraints of the environment. So I use like the stick in that example, right? Where my fiance is trying to jump over. We're both trying to jump over the stick, and we change where the stick is, what the angle is. Is it high at the beginning? Is it high at the end? We could change, of course, the start position, the end position. By doing that, we learn in such a more rich way. It's so much more engaging and fun. And you also get so much more out of it. That's a little bit what I was talking about with the not actually being a generalist, but being a specialist in the Ido Portal method. In Ido's method, we take parkour and then we extract out of it rail bounces and precision jumps. And that's what we do. And we do tons of stuff in those specific areas, right? Versus, let's bring that context in, right? What is precision? So, for instance, like with Ido stuff, we're pretty much always doing precision jumps to either a spot on the floor or a stair. But things change if you do a precision jump to a log, right? That's where a lot of this comes from. Is you're out in the woods, you want to get from this log to that log, this rock to that rock.
Yeah.
When you never do that, it's not actually that you really you've installed a more program and then you just get to apply it to this different thing. It's you are operating in that environment and you've never operated in this environment. And now that's going to be a tough shift. And that's what we see. Like where I would struggle with that. And that's why I said I wasn't really learning that real core movement intelligence that is the point of the whole approach. When we use tasks and we see that stuff, we really think about it and understand it. Now we can start to really understand and develop that real movement intelligence. So we could do that.
In my experience, that was really key. I never actually formally worked with Ido. Aside from this point, I think the emotional parts were never quite resonant with me. And I think resonance is really important with a student-coach relationship.
Oh, yeah.
But what I can say is I was lucky enough to train with like quite high-level parkour people in real life. And I didn't do any lessons. We just explored the context of parkour. And as you're saying, this kind of hyper-varied environmental practice then became really valuable. And if I then went to an isolated drill or training protocol, like landing on this edge, landing on that edge, it was nothing. It was the most simple thing. Whereas someone that was spending 3 years doing online coaching, practicing precision jumps, they were still horrible at precision jumps. And it was always hilarious to me, be like, I don't know what's going on. These guys are practicing all the time this one thing. And it's only now in hindsight when you present something like this approach that it's like, duh. It makes sense.
Exactly. And
so I'm lucky in that sense. I feel the exposure I got from sports and teachers was more towards this approach, I would say, happenstance, not guided that way. And it's only now when research catches up that you're like, oh, cool, it makes sense. So I feel very grateful that you're doing this work to allow people to really see a clarity of learning process and long-term development,
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I think just to compare, I'm not sure how my parkour experience would match up to yours, like as far as how much time I've spent doing precision jumps and rail balances. But what I can say for sure is you're way better at parkour than me, right? Like from the clips I've seen, like I know how you move. You're a great mover. And, it's wild the extent to which I bet if we went out and we had a parkour session, you're like, hey, let's do some stuff over here, right? Like you've done with those experts. You may not even be able to notice that I have parkour experience, right? From my very isolated approach to precision jumps and rails. Right? Versus, like you said, if we switch the roles, if we test you having done a much more complex thing on the more isolated task, hey, Will, can you do this precision jump here? You're like, yeah, no problem. Boom. You fucking nail it. Because you've been doing more complex things with all sorts of more rich dynamics and information.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's something that's difficult from my perspective. Obviously, I don't want to only dig into the negative aspects of the Ido Portal kind of work. Obviously, it's a huge catalyst towards positive change.
Absolutely.
And I do think there's an interesting balance between, obviously, the ecological approach is quite chaotic in nature. Like the very essence is kind of leaning into chaos to provide a variety of stimulus to then adapt and proceed. But I do feel like when it comes to then business viability and kind of packaging things and even positive feedback loops for people that are partaking in this kind of quote unquote method, it's important to have certain constraints or boxes or frameworks or focus points. You know what I mean? And I think maybe the best thing to do in this conversation right now is to lean towards the negative connotations of ecological dynamics to try and break them down. For example, if we go towards the chaotic elements, I feel like from what I understand of the constraints-led approach, it's to a certain extent self-organizing. And so based upon the traditional method, you'd have this kind of ABC approach. So at every step of the learning process, the learner would have a clarity of what the next milestone or what the next step is, or when they succeeded, when they didn't. And it's quite a nice, simplistic feedback loop. Whereas the constraint-led approach is a bit more chaotic and a bit more dynamic. And I wonder, do you see that as a limitation, or how do you get past that? How do you implement positive feedback loops?
Yeah, great question. So like that is something that I think is at the core culturally of maybe the origin of some of this linear pedagogy, that we want to have experts, we want to learn from experts that can tell us, learn this first, you must do this, then you'll be able to do this, then you'll be able to do that, right? That helps us feel more confident. Honestly, at this point, my thought on that dilemma a little bit is people just make so much more progress with the CLA that even though, like, what you're talking about is a very core of what we call like linear pedagogy, traditional coaching, versus the other way to say ecological approach is nonlinear pedagogy, where we're not thinking of skill as linearly acquired as you just do more reps. So basically, if you're not giving people, okay, do this, then you do that, then you do that, and rather we say, we give them the whole environment fundamentally, rather than decomposing the practice into, okay, this is the first component of a precision jump, and then this is the second component of a precision jump, then this is a precision jump, then this is a precision jump on different surfaces. We immediately jump to, here's a precision jump on different surfaces. And it's a little harder, but you progress so much faster in your overall capabilities that even though maybe to some extent you're not like, we're never saying like, you've mastered phase 1 of this thing so much, but it's like, you leave at the end of the session, you're like, I can kind of do precision jumps on different surfaces now, right? Whereas in the traditional approach, depending on your teacher, you could spend months on those very basic steps because they feel that you have to isolate those, right?
Yeah.
Versus, you can learn a basic amount of that in a day.
I think intuitively it makes sense if you look at kind of people's parenting styles and what I would guess most people's preferred method would be. At least philosophically, for me, like I hate it when I see people get overly parented and they get like hyper limited with, don't do that. Oh my God, get down from there. And hey, you're gonna hurt yourself. And it's like the kid's smiling, having a great time. What do you mean you're going to hurt yourself? How do you know what's gonna happen in the future? Now, obviously, parents at home are gonna destroy me because I've not felt that parental love, but I do feel like on the flip side, if you allow, from what I've seen in friends and whatnot, and in my own upbringing, parents that are a bit more easy with allowing children to do X, Y, and Z get hurt within the realms of how much hurt is viable towards health and longevity. I feel like most people tend towards that being the better way of parenting. And therefore, it kind of also makes sense in the learning sphere. It's like, allow yourself to explore and get things wrong. And then I think the key point is then, in my mind, when you do something wrong, have someone, a partner or a teacher, give you maybe not the answer, but give you the feedback of, yeah, you did that wrong. Is that within the approach?
It could be. I mean, I wouldn't. I would rarely say something like that, given the current understanding I'm at. What I would say, even if you see something that's like really an egregious mistake, it's like really, I don't see any way that you doing that behavior is going to lead to a functional outcome. Those things do happen. The way I'll approach it is try doing it like this, right? You're giving them incentive. Or even better, if you can, you tell them try doing it like this, and then you put them in a situation where they are really going to be forced. So for instance, in jiu-jitsu, if someone's choking you, like as they get this top arm, this choking arm comes deeper across your neck, it becomes very threatening very quickly, right? And so if you grab lower on the forearm, people tend to grab low on the forearm because they're trying to stop it. They grab what they can here. And then the thing is, if you're skilled enough to just know what you're doing, you can keep just crawling up, and they can't stop it by grabbing low.
Yeah.
If you grab high, you have much better mechanical, like you look at like torque is force times distance, right? So you just multiply, what's the distance here of this lever arm versus like to now go all the way out here, it's so much more. So if you grab at the hands, almost anyone can really stop someone much stronger from getting that choke. So that's something you see pretty often with beginners in jiu-jitsu. When I see that, I won't really tell them, hey, you're doing that wrong. Conceivably, there's situations where you might want to grab here for who knows what reason, who knows the different body sizes and the dynamics of what could happen. But that's generally very suboptimal. So I'll tell them, try grabbing at the hand, and then I'll say, okay, here's the situation. You're already, your partner's already got the hand here, ready, go. And then the reality is just if they don't grab the hand, they're going to get choked. They do that 20 times. They've learned it very quickly. They stop doing it. And again, not in a conscious way that they have to think about it, but just their body is learning, okay, we're going here.
So essentially, to boil that down, you present them this specific scenario and give them, okay, in the next 20 minutes, drill just this scenario and find different methods of escape.
Yeah, usually even
and there's your result.
something like that, like 3 to 5 minutes, and you see a solution. And so the argument here it's not about chaos and not chaos, right? It's about there's a certain amount of chaos that is really helpful, a certain amount of variability that's really helpful. And when we do things with tasks, it's not just like, yeah, leave the kids, for 10 hours and go do whatever. It's like, how do you let them explore, but keep it such that the consequences are not severe?
Right. And there's the constraints.
Yeah.
Interesting. Another problem I see, therefore, is kind of in relation to that, too much freedom too soon. When you find someone with just, let's say you post-gaming era, and you haven't got the kind of base, as you call it, movement intelligence.
Yeah.
And then you're put into a context. So let's say I'm teaching you a handstand at that time. And I just say, okay, you have 3 to 5 minutes to just explore kicking upside down against the wall.
Yeah.
And I just see after the 5 minutes, you've made all the mistakes in the book, but you haven't quite hit upon any form of sustainable understanding moving forward. Like, where does the approach go from there?
Well, so you would hit on some, so handstands are,
You'd hope.
you would. Well, what you would at least hit upon is ways to not do it, right? So handstand is a great example of something like it's fairly static and it's extremely challenging. Even a 2-arm handstand is an extremely challenging position or movement, right? So there's no way in which you say, hey, try a handstand, you leave them for 2 hours and they just get it. Right? Not really. Not if they don't already at some level have that skill. So But then what we're also working with predominantly there, in my eyes, is like physical limitations. Your wrist can only handle so much. Your shoulders can only handle so much. Most beginners, their shoulders, scapula cannot really handle that load without like, and elbows too, without a lot of shaking. And with that shaking, it becomes extremely challenging to balance. So there's a level there which we need to generally develop the physical capacity. So that's a limiting factor generally. If we imagine though a theoretical scenario where people didn't have that limitation, if somehow you have beginners come in where their wrist could handle body weight for, I don't know, 5 hours a day, and their shoulders have all the strength necessary to balance stable, then that's where you could really just throw them into a lot of different tasks of like, okay, try to balance. And then like, okay, you start pushing them around. Like, okay, like for instance, maybe like you have someone standing, you push them in a different direction. Okay, now try to get to a handstand. And like start from the floor. Now try to get to a handstand. Start from the floor on your stomach. Try to get to a handstand. Start from the wall. Try to get to a handstand slowly. Start back to wall. Try to get to a handstand slowly. There's a drill that I came up with my partner that I really love, where you go, it in a way merges both of the development of the basic physical capacity with also an initial development of the skill of how do I place my body weight over my hands, where you have someone do chest to wall, right? So imagine you walk up chest to wall, but now you give them targets and different constraints and things to avoid. So imagine, okay, you're chest to wall, and then I say like, avoid my hand. And I move my hand and now I'm touching your legs. And you have to figure out how can you move your
I
legs,
gotcha.
right? And in doing that, you are figuring, again, you've got some weight on the wall, so it makes it, there's assistance. It makes it possible. It makes it so that you're not actually completely balancing your weight over your hands, but there's a certain minimum at which, like, if your weight really comes off, basically like the distance between your hands and the wall, then you're going to fall. So you have to balance your weight to a small degree, or a significant degree, not nearly as much as actually just hand balancing on two hands, but you challenge people's ability to move around in the handstand chest to wall. And now what they're learning is so much more than when you just isolate that, okay, hold 60 seconds, hold chest to wall, just do sets and sets and sets until you do 60 seconds, and then we can start toe pulls, right?
Yeah. We played a very similar game in my classes in London, but it was always a 3-player game. So you take the wall out of the equation and you'd open up more of a 360 realm, or at least a 270, because the third person is obviously holding a leg, and it's really allowing this proprioceptive nature of okay, what is the inverted wall offering me right now, or not offering me right now? On this level, I always used it as, especially in beginner students, I used it as an engaging conditioning practice that I felt like was at least emotionally valuable, because it gives a sense of awareness and freedom in space in that specific orientation. But I never saw it as a skill vector, let's say.
Yeah.
I never saw it as something that was like, yeah, that's definitely going to have carryover.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the ecological dynamics idea is suggesting that that would also have a skill carryover?
Absolutely. Now, the question becomes, how much carryover do you get from that to freestanding handstand? And that becomes about how close is the information that you're getting when someone's helping you balance to when someone's not helping you balance. And the reality, as you know, is that those are unfortunately very different,
worlds.
even when you just got that little bit of weight, and it's a different world when you go off. But so for instance, another way to think about that, so that's a tricky one where like that's such a great thing, and yet I'm a little bit with you that you're definitely developing skill, but how much does that skill of all the things you're learning there transfer to all the things you would want to do there just without the
Yeah.
The thing, because you're training the most critical information source.
Yeah.
But if you do a game like that, but it's freestanding, and now instead of the third person, I don't know what the other person is doing, but if you have people are giving different targets, okay,
Exactly.
touch your leg to my hand here. Now, and they're not balancing with you. Now they get to keep all that information. They get to develop a much more dynamic, alive skill that represents
Yeah.
much more what we want people to actually develop when they learn hand balancing.
100%. I have a thought on this, and I feel like, as we mentioned before, you don't gain high levels of skill from 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months. It's 3, 5+ years. And this is where I think the ecological dynamics is difficult for a lot of the culture in like big cities, especially. People want the thing now, but I think hopefully valuable long term. Because if we're able to change like culture and if you get people involved, you don't only get something that's fun and engaging and alive, you get like a long-term sustainable process that, yes, maybe is slower on the whole, especially in, I would caveat this with low chaotic environments. Progress might be slower with this type of approach, but
Like what? What are you?
longer term, like in a handstand, for example,
Mm.
if I was to take like person A, person B, but they're both the same person through like tons of drills like we're talking about right now, compared to like the standardized approach of like toe pull, heel pull, chest to wall, kick up, blah, blah, blah. I think if you compared them within 6 months, probably the person doing the standardized traditional approach would be maybe further along in relation to the end goal of like a 10-second, 30 seconds handstand.
Mhm.
But if you compared them in a year or 3 years, I would guess that relationship would invert. And the person doing the ecological dynamics type of approach would have a far better capacity to do much more. Their skill, therefore, in relation to the handstand world, would be much higher than in comparison to someone that's doing the isolated step-by-step approach. Does that map?
I Yes, but I don't think so. I think you would see. So the thing is, like, having this understanding now, I'm not going to throw out if someone comes to me and they say I want a freestanding handstand, I'm not going to throw out the toe pulls and heel pulls. Right? We're still doing the toe pulls and heel pulls. I would replace the chest to walls with a more dynamic version. And what we're going to
Right.
do is the toe pulls and heel pulls, instead of just doing reps, I'm going to add variation. Like every
Yeah.
rep, I
Yeah.
want a little different. By doing that, I've already had some people doing that. They are making faster progress. And then again, like you're
Right.
saying, so they're going to make some faster progress now. It's going to be more engaging, and they're learning a much wider, more applicable version of the skill. And that's true. The
Mm,
more complex the skill, the more you'll see that. The handstand is a pretty narrow skill. So,
yeah.
it's not going to
Okay.
be an enormous difference. And
This brings me to my next question in an exciting way. So metrics. You're a scientist. I bet, you at a certain point you love metrics. You love to measure something and look at the data. When you offer a constraints-led approach and you take away a certain amount of reps and sets type drilling and you offer, explore this for the next 3 to 5 minutes, for example, as a practitioner, A, how do you judge, like, how do you measure your uh, activity, your progress, your failures, etc.? And then as a coach, how do you manage that long term? Like, how do you program that?
great question. So there's a lot of metrics that we just never had, right? Like, what's a metric for movement intelligence? We don't even have a test for that, right? Like,
For me, it's an orientation.
yeah,
I don't want it to be. Let's look at the AI question again. I don't want it to be dataized. For me, it's like because we're such complex systems. My feeling is like it's the bar of soap analogy. Like you want to make sure it's there, but you don't want to hold on to it too tight. You want to just have it as an orientation. And if you try to make it too clear, it kind of loses its value. But sorry, I've jumped in.
no, functionally, I'm there with you. The only difference, I would love to have a metric if it was accurate, but the reality, I think, functionally is that, like, you as far as I know, anyway, that I think about that right now, you're not going to have a really good metric. You're going to have something that's like very, fakeable and specific and
Simplified.
exactly, simplified, extremely simplified and crude. So the way I think about it now is that there are physical capabilities that matter. We call this effectivities or action capacities, right? So what we're not saying is that your max deadlift doesn't matter at all, right? There are things, that I feel all the time in grappling. If someone doesn't have strength in their neck and spinal erectors, when we go to tie up, I just snap them to the floor. And, there's an extent to which you can get more skilled, but if you're physically, so weak, like I used to be, that's an extreme vulnerability, right? So, like, vice versa, when you have those wider, larger reserves of physical capacity and strength and mobility and resilience and cardio, you have a much wider array of skills you can learn. So learning can happen faster when all those affordances are present in the landscape of affordances. It just hasn't become like embodied. You haven't perceived a lot of those affordances yet. You don't know where and
Do you
when
think
to
there's a
use
limit
them.
to that? Do you think it's like a normal distribution curve? Like there's a sweet spot to capacity, if we can, like physical preparedness, before it kind of teeters off down the other side?
Well, functionally, yes, right? So I think the more physical capacity we have, the more affordances we're going to have. But the reality is, you don't get those higher physical capacities without spending more time developing them. And there's definitely a trade-off where how much time you're spending developing the physical capacities is now time that you're not really developing skill. There is a really interesting area where that hasn't really been explored yet of how can we apply ecological dynamics, for instance, to strength training, where it's interesting because there's some research I'm aware of that suggests that actually a smaller number, the like barest bit of variability is something we work with a lot in strength training, is how many different exercises are you using? There's some research that like a smaller number of exercises can sometimes do better than a larger number of exercises, at least when we're testing on specific things. But what that suggests, again, since we don't see that in the skill research, since in the skill research, even when we narrow down, the CLA does better, we don't have that dilemma there. Versus in the strength and physical capacities research, it may be a little bit, it does seem like much more of a dilemma of how much variability are we going to use here? Because if you imagine, if we tried applying differential learning to deadlifts, right? I've played with this a little bit, but so imagine instead of doing all your deadlifts that, today you're doing conventional deadlifts, you'll work up to 3 sets of 5 challenging sets. You know, 3 challenging sets of 5 reps. Okay, and you're doing them in the same stance, right? And they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty damn close. Versus, what does it look like if every deadlift we do is in a different stance? Well, that's interesting, but my guess from a little bit of the research and a little bit of applied experience is I think we're still going to develop a little more strength when we're doing the more conventional deadlifts. And like maybe there's some more variability we can add, especially in accessory. Like maybe we do the 3 sets of 5 and then we do another set where we're doing the stances different every time. And there's some balance there, but it's not literally like what we're saying in the skill research, certainly for something like Jiu-Jitsu or like function-oriented sports, is we're saying you can throw out the techniques and do better.
Yeah.
And I think
that was my point earlier on. In lower complexity fields, it doesn't make as much sense as toward higher complexity fields, at least right now.
Yes.
And I think this is where specificity becomes really important. In like strength training, for example, of course, specificity, how the body adapts, is incredibly clear. but less so in something as dynamic and complex as grappling, when you have a multitude of complex factors all dictating the outcome.
Exactly.
And that's maybe the nuance here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw, going back a bit, I saw in the video there was an interesting maybe mismatch between the results in tennis. So when you presented the research in your video, it looked to me like the long-term effects of traditional versus the CLM in your tennis subgroups, or not your group, but the research that you looked at, didn't benefit so much. Is that true?
So,
Or did I misread?
well, there's two. If you're talking about the Lee study, so that was the one where I do talk about it a little later in the documentary, where that and I think is one other study really suggests one really key weakness of ecological dynamics, or at least one area where the traditional approach does better, which is optimizing form scores. So and that's important in certain sports, right? So if we're looking at gymnastics or figure skating, we don't care just about like who gets the most flips done. We care, how do those flips look? How did you land with your feet together? How many steps did you? We literally have written in the code of points how far
Like
you deviate from that
points.
ideal technique and how many points you're going to get deducted, which is generally like more than the skill is worth, you know? So
Completely.
in those sorts of things, to the extent that how you do the thing matters, the traditional approach is better, because in the ecological approach, we're leveraging self-organization. We're leveraging degrees of freedom and degeneracy, and that you can achieve the same outcome in very many different ways with a lot of, and that's very valuable for skill. But again, when what we want is for the thing to look a certain way, while self-organization starts to be, there's only so many ways you can self-organize the pirouette to look precisely as they want it in ballet and figure skating, right?
Yeah.
Hence, the traditional approach is more optimized, because that's exactly what we're working on in the traditional approach. We're repeating it. And what are we doing when we're repeating? We're still self-organizing. We're just self-organizing to a very narrow area, which so happens in those sports to be exactly what we want.
Gotcha. So let's go back to the conversation on strength and the interest potentially of this. Can I call it a method? Idea?
It's a framework. Yeah, the ecological
Framework.
dynamics is a framework or a scientific field of understanding.
Have you seen, so I've seen some example, I would call them examples of this framework being used in like kids strength and kind of, it makes sense in that field because it's all about engagement and just something is better than nothing. And the variety of exposure is great at that level of kind of kids below 14, 16. But have you experienced it yourself as an adult, or have you tried to apply this as an adult to strength or capacity at least?
What do you mean exactly?
Have you tried to apply the framework? Because you mentioned a bit about you tried it with some deadlifts.
Yeah. So far, so there's different ways you could go about it, right? Like, for instance, for grappling, we could think about, how do we do strength training that's going to be applicable to grappling? Ideally, in grappling, we're always moving another person. So what we want to do is learn how to move loads like another person, and potentially like exactly, just move another person in different ways. Then the dilemma there becomes that it could be a little, now you're just doing things that are suboptimal for skill development, like where the strength is inherent in the task. If the strength is inherent in the sport and the tasks are inherent to the sport. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I think that the risk of injury is higher. For instance, the risk of injury is much higher in grappling than it is in weightlifting. Why? Because in weightlifting, we control the loads. We get to say down to, if you want, the gram, how much weight are you going to lift based on how much weight you lifted yesterday, versus when we're lifting another person, things get a lot more chaotic. We get these loads that are variable that I don't think work so well with how the body responds to loading, where we've got a kind of an optimal amount of stress and strain. And, you go below that, we don't get much. You go much above that, we get injured. Versus in, weightlifting, we get to keep it in that nice area exactly how we want, So I've experimented a little bit with it. I've still got questions about how effective it is there. Again, for me, my thinking right now is probably a little more effective to do things that are a little more traditional for strength. Maybe have a little bit of like more like building some variability in, having things be a little bit, sport specific tasks. Again, like the precision jump task. For instance, we can have box jumps in our strength training or strength and conditioning, but why just jump on the same box every time? We can add variability there. That's an easy way we can add some variability that's going to have be a little more productive for, developing our physical capacities and our skills. So that's a win.
Or at least the skill of the jump. It's hard to say unequivocally that type of approach would improve the capacity, the physical capacity in relation to the jump. The skill, yes.
Yeah.
This is kind of the core of my question on metrics. I feel like some of the issue is the measurability of constraint-led tasks.
Yeah. So,
which is more or less relevant in different fields.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of relevant in like development of strength.
Yeah. I'll give you a different direction for the same thing, which is mobility. So one of the things I found with mobility is, so the extremes here are FRC on one side, where FRC, you lock everything down and then you're doing your different like cars, right? You're doing circles through the whole range of motion. You've got your pails and rails. So, you're easing off the end range and going back into it. Different things. They're effective. That's clear. Cool. But it's very isolated. You do it one joint at a time. You're doing different things, just isolating one joint at a time. If we want to do a whole body program with FRC, we're now talking about 3 hours a day of training. On the other side, you have what I've been experimenting with lately, which has been having some really awesome results, is you're just giving, and I'm sure you've already done some things like this, where you're just giving people tasks of like, okay, you're standing on one leg, touch your hand to this target. And now I'm continuously moving that around. And so now people are balancing. Now all of their joints are working together to find the range of motion. So you can target that a little bit, right? Like particularly the hips. The hips can be a little tighter. So when we have people lift their legs higher, that gets really challenging and interesting for people. And then, again, they're balancing the whole time, so they're getting good use out of that. But then we can also do things with two targets. So like touch your hand here and your leg there, and we're moving those around. Like things get really interesting. We get to develop mobility in ways that you just don't when you're doing things like FRC. You just don't develop that at all. And
there's a real world application, maybe.
Much more real world application. It's very effective. It's much more fun. And the other benefit we get out of these more variable demands that come out of tasks is we are loading all these structures in more variable ways, right? Like if you're doing a traditional stretching thing, you're loading, in this very like linear, okay, we're loading forward this much, and then we're loading this much, and we're loading, middle splits this much. And that can be a little bit easier to overwhelm. The way I see it is like you're isolating a specific capacity of a specific group of, muscles, tendons, ligaments, and fascia in a very specific way. So that's a little easier to overwhelm than, for instance, when you're doing these active mobility tasks, it's much more, you're never loading really this one specific group of things in this one specific way. It's so variable that it
Yeah.
feels really hard to overwhelm, and it feels really good.
I would like to push back a little bit.
Mhm.
So I feel like how I coach and share is kind of a synergy of the two
Yeah.
perspectives. As we kind of touched on before, like specificity is really important. So this kind of specific targeted approach is valid because it gives the system a clarity. And I do feel like clarity can be quite useful, and
Yeah.
it gives people like a good feedback of what to feel in maybe a more complex situation. And I think feeling and embodiment is something valuable. If someone can't feel how to access a certain range of motion, and then you also add a greater level of chaos in a like a one-leg balance drill, I haven't seen too many experiences or examples of people improving range that they don't possess. I think I've seen people exploring range that they possess. They how do I say this well? I've seen examples of people
They get more skilled exploring range that they already have.
exactly,
Yeah.
but they do not open up greater range than they currently have
Yeah.
in more isolated situations. And that's the key part, which is an interesting philosophical point of view, is how much is enough. But I want to throw into something. So something I find interesting is there's I think we can call it a law, the Weber-Fechner law, which is the kind of the law of just noticeable difference. So it's kind of maybe a psychological idea as well of perception is incredibly important in training and learning.
Yeah.
Proprioception, interoception, exteroception, the understanding of self. If you cannot perceive something, it's hard to maybe understand it and then move forward, which is kind of a middle ground here, maybe. But the law suggests that as intensity rises, perception slows.
Mhm.
So you can imagine, like, when you're completely terrified or overwhelmed by something, that the word overwhelmed is indicative of how much you can perceive. You perceive less because of the intensity of a situation. A very simple example is, let's say I ask you to hold your hand out, and I put a 1 kilo plate in your hand, and then I put another 1 kilo plate in your hand. You'd feel a huge difference.
Right.
But if I put a 10 kilo plate or a 20 kilo plate in your hand, and I put the same 1 kilo plate on top of it, the difference isn't that noticeable
Yeah.
because you're more overwhelmed in the original
Right.
situation.
There's a higher
And I
intensity.
think that's a key aspect of this approach is if an organism is already at the capacity of overwhelm or ability to uh, find a level of stasis in chaos,
Yeah.
I wonder how much that is conducive to a negative response rather than a positive response.
Yeah. Weber-Fechner law, you called it?
Mhm.
So it's really interesting. That's a great idea you're bringing up. Are you familiar with Gabby Wolf's research?
Tell me, because at least for the listeners and
Yeah.
myself, it would be good.
So her research a lot was, she came up with optimal theory in combination with Rebecca Luthwaite, and they've done a lot of research on external focus of attention. I mentioned it a little bit in the documentary somewhere.
Mhm.
The idea being when we're looking at a functional goal. So if we give someone a dart throwing task, for instance, and we give them an external focus of attention cue, so like focus on, aiming for, I don't know what you would cue in darts, like the top part of the numbers, or I don't know, aim for the center, or whatever whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
Versus we give them an internal focus cue, a cue that's focused on their body movement. So like focus on the
Mm.
flick of your wrist at the end of the throw.
Right.
We see better performance and better learning with the external focus cues across a wide variety of research. Although, not to add too much complexity to the picture, but lately we're starting to, there's starting to be more nuance now. But
Yes.
I think it's pretty clear when we're optimizing a functional thing that those external focus cues are still better. And so I've always had a bit of this like skepticism about this like very sensation focused approach to movement that we can have in general. Like, if we're boxing, we're grappling, we don't want to give these internal focus cues. We want to give external effect based cues. It becomes more interesting if we start talking about something like dance, right? Like in dance, that's such a big part of at least a conventional approach to dance that it's hard to imagine that that's completely off. I wonder, especially if you look at the highest level dancers, what I find is a bit of a qualitative difference between like the top of the top and like the people that are like, they move quite well, but there is that separation there. It's the quality of how they're doing the movement, how they're expressing it, right? Like the facial expressions, the like.
It's not even the quality of the movement, it's like the content of the movement, I would say.
Yeah. However you want
There's
to.
something there that's maybe immeasurable in that way. If we're thinking about this in the same manner, like, why do you like how that person moves compared to that person?
Yeah.
And especially for me, if you could compare something like football compared to dance, I would say, soccer for ease. A lot of people's favorite players would probably, you'd be able to map their physicality more evenly onto a scale of like uh, postural efficiency, maybe, compared to dance. And
Right.
I'd be like, oh yeah, my favorite player is Cristiano Ronaldo. But if you look at like gait analysis and posture in the air and how he holds himself in dynamic positioning, it's like, yeah, he looks the best playing because he's the most efficient in relation to physics. But it doesn't quite hold up the same way in dance, right? Like there's something about content of movement that's really engaging and interesting in dance that's especially modern dance. Like
Yeah.
ballet, maybe it's different. There's a lot of aesthetic, like gymnastics, same. But I think in contemporary dance, there's a lot of value put into the subjective content of dance. But sorry, I've completely derailed your
No,
point.
not at all, because this is exactly the point. That
Okay.
this is what my thought is at this time. So I'll tell you, I did a Gaga intensive a few
Hmm.
years ago in Tel Aviv with Ahad Nareen and many of the company, Batsheva dance company. So these are top of the top professional dancers. This is arguably
Yeah.
one of, if not the greatest dance company in the world. They are amazing. They are such incredibly good movers. And so I spent a week trying to keep up with them, And one of the what I noticed, this is where I really, really was engaging with that. Like, oh, there's something qualitatively different about how they're moving. So in Gaga, what they do, in a way, it's like kind of inconsistent, but also incredibly consistent with ecological dynamics. Where what
Hmm.
they do, have you tried the Gaga at all?
Not in any way that I can say in public.
So it's very interesting. I think you would like it and get a lot out of it. I think
Yeah.
pretty much
Yeah.
everyone would. But essentially, imagine you're doing a dance class, but it's a stream of cues. So, you come in, there's no mirrors, so you're not, the idea is that you're not going to be overly focused on how you're moving. You're just focused on like kind of expressing and like doing the thing. So,
Yeah.
so you come in and the stereotypical cues. Oh, let's imagine you're floating, and you just move however that means for you, right? So you're just doing that. You're expressing that, and okay, let's imagine your joints are lubricating. They're oiling up every time you move, right? And you add layers of these, cues by analogy, kind of internal focus things that they're not at no time are they telling you extend your left elbow, right?
Yeah.
Do more hip extension. They're never telling you anything like that. And so what it feels like they're training is that expression, that that
Mm.
content that we were talking about, right? And that feels like the difference between the highest level dancers and the people that are just a notch below is they really have that content that feels potentially somatic in nature. That potentially feels about the experience they're having and expressing through their movement rather than the gross motor coordination. So I guess what I'm saying is if you took like a wire body diagram of two dancers moving and you're just looking at their gross movement, where did the hand go? Where does the elbow go? Where does the shoulder go? And you have top notch dancer and a very good dancer, that they would look they could look pretty much the same, and yet when you actually look at them moving, you see there's something that more experienced dancer has that the other one doesn't, and that may be the somatic experiencing level of like feeling. What does it feel like when I'm on the floor and we're moving like I'm boiling pasta, that someone's really like the high level dancer has really got a very finely tuned sense of like really boiling like pasta, right?
I'm clipping this up.
It was a really good one. That was actually a very fun one when we
That was
did that.
good. That was good.
But it's that sort of thing, right? So I wonder if, I guess my point is, it seems like for learning the gross whole body movements, that these like external functional focus things are better. But for dance, it may very well be that content oriented, somatic oriented thing is critical, at some point to get to that full level of expression. And yeah, maybe we have to really think about teaching people to feel, to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so that's where I see that having use. But at the same time, in general, when we have a functional orientation, like if my goal is actually to increase someone's mobility, I don't see that as a functional impediment at all if they can like feel or not feel their leg. Like not in a way that we can't develop just through a functional orientation. If someone said, "Oh, I can't feel where my legs are or like my hips or like the difference between my hip, my I don't know, my quad and my patellar tendon or whatever level of like, specificity that problem may have," I would have faith that if I give them a functional task, okay, stand on my leg, touch this here, they're going to start to figure it out. They're going to start to figure it out in
Gotcha.
orientation to solving the task. And to the point you were making about like exploring the range they already have, I think that's a very critical thing. That's where the task design really comes in. Because if you give people too open of a task, okay, just dance, move, go, they're not going to develop new range. That's uncomfortable. Of course not. They're going to get more skilled in the range they have, but they're not going to develop new range. But if you force them to, you're standing on one leg or you're staying in this position, but I need you to touch, your belly button here, they're going to be forced to develop more mobility. So that will happen. And it will happen, I think, from what I've seen, very effectively. It feels really good.
Yeah, man. Awesome. I think more experience can only be a benefit. I do feel like there's a synergy. I feel like you're coming at this in a really nice way, like a refreshing way. It's not, this is the new thing that everyone should be doing only. It's like, here's a framework that's incredibly potent in these fields, and it could be also interesting in these fields. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It makes sense, you know?
Depending on what we're looking at,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm fully aware it's Sunday and we've been going for 2.5 hours. Let's do this. I would love to round out with some like practical tips for the listeners. And I feel like what would be interesting to put you on the spot here is let's move away from coaching and how this can be valid for coaches. And let's move to the solo practitioner, someone listening at home and they're, just bumbling through their own methods. As me and you have been at times and probably still are at other times. How do you see this framework being applied to an individual practice?
Dude, that's where it's so good. So that's where it's so powerful, because in the traditional approach, you need an expert to tell you what movements to do and how to do it and give you feedback on how you're
Right.
doing it wrong. Here, we can think about, take whatever you want to learn, turn that into a task, allow yourself to explore that task and explore the many ways you can achieve some sort of functional goal in a representative environment of whatever you want to do. It could be anything, and it'll be so much.
Give me an example.
So much more fun and engaging. So I'll give you a completely. I'll probably give you a few examples, but completely different approach. So last week I presented at like my first international conference talking about ecological dynamics, and tried to condense ecological dynamics and BJJ and my approach to BJJ using this into 12 minutes, which was so tough. And so what I was doing, I made the presentation, but I was giving myself the task of, let me get through this presentation as much like I'm presenting to a real audience as possible in this time. Go, running the task instead of like, I don't know, like trying to memorize the words I was going to say. It could be a totally different approach to like write a script and then say that and practice how I'm going to say that. But I tried to make it as representative as possible. Here's my slides. I was using this mouse and like pretending it was my laser pointer, so I'd stand away from my laptop, and I was in the hotel room, so I put it like near in front of the TV stand basically. And then I'd pretend I was presenting to all these people, and I'd like walk around and like, basically give my presentation as I was going through the slides. Right. So like, again, like anything you want to do, turn it into a task and like give yourself some sort of outcome to optimize towards, even if it's more somatic in nature, right? Like you could lay down on the floor and be like, oh, how do I move like I'm a boiling pasta? Right? Like if that's what you want to explore, that's a really interesting area. And what I would really encourage people to do is use that principle of constrain to afford. And the other way to say that I also really love is constrain to explore. Use constraints that force you to explore new areas that you haven't explored before. And that's where things will really improve. And what you find is there's so many, you can go in something you've been exploring for 10 years every day, and it's pretty easy to make some constraints where all of a sudden, I've never been trying this before, right? Wow, this is so interesting. I'm learning so much, right? So another example for cartwheels, I've been playing with, okay, just 2 minutes, I'm just doing inversions with rotation. Like just that concept. How many ways can I do inversions with rotation? I'm just figuring out, playing with that. Oh, it's so much more interesting and engaging, and should be more effective than just how many different ways, like, or how many times can I do a helicoptero, right?
Yeah.
Like, replace the repetition and the drilling with tasks and exploring, and if needed with variation along, so the example I gave in the movement video, say you do decide you want to learn a helicoptero. I don't think there's any functional task where helicoptero is an optimal solution for that task, right? Like
Well, I have one. This is how I learned the helicoptero. So, somebody placed a bottle or a ball or an object underneath a bench. Like where your feet, if you're sitting on the bench, where your feet would be, that the bottle would be there, right?
Yeah.
And then was like cartwheel over this bench and kick the bottle. It works.
Yeah, that one hasn't worked for me so much. I'll try exploring it more.
Interesting. You should.
But
that to me is essentially this framework.
Yeah.
Like, that's exactly how I learned on a raised surface. It was like, because the switching of the hips in a helicopter. For anyone that's listening, a helicopter is a cartwheel from, I believe, capoeira, Audic helicoptero, and the legs do like a 360 in space. The hips switch over. So you perform a cartwheel in the same way, and you end up arching, exiting like a reversal and like a contralateral pattern. And your first leg does a 360 loop and becomes the non-landing leg. Um, I don't know. I think that for me, it made no sense whatsoever. I saw it. This guy in the park doing it in Berlin. Shout out to Malik if he was ever watching this, but he was doing it and it was amazing. And I was like, there's no way in hell I'm gonna ever be able to do that. And he just gave me this task in the park. I didn't know who he was, what it was going on. He was like, yeah, try this. Boom. I didn't get it immediately, but practicing just that task gave me the feeling of switching the hips. He didn't tell me, do a cartwheel and switch your hips.
Right.
And it opened up this pathway of awareness in my body, like you're talking about, that then moved into actually the learning of the skill. But I get your point. I think it's not a functional outcome to anything unless you have a very good constraint task. And then it comes useful.
Again, I mean, that's a really interesting counterpoint, right? Because the helicoptero is one of the things I think about that is like the most non-functional, really. Like it's such an aesthetic thing, and it's so gorgeous. And I absolutely love it. But that's a very valid counterpoint. They're like, oh, actually, no, you basically learned it from a task, and you do it very, very well. So
yeah. And I had no idea what ecological dynamics was. I don't think this guy did either. It was like, it's really hard to explain, so I'm not going to try. Just do it like this. Or maybe it's an emergent early example of now what we understand as, But it kind of goes to show like experience is understanding. Before you cognize something and you understand it verbally or cognitively, you have it as an embodied experience.
Exactly.
Potentially. Yeah. Dude, there's so much more we could talk about, but I'm aware that it's Sunday and you've had a huge week. Where can people find the documentary? Because I'm sure people are going to be wanting more now, because I feel like I've torn apart the documentary without giving the beauty of the full thing. So please.
Yeah, it's just on my YouTube channel, Bren Teaches Movement. It's called Beyond Technique: The Next Revolution in BJJ. And it is very much applied to jiu-jitsu, but it really can be applied anywhere. It's very like we were saying, like there's parenting applications that that's one of the reasons I basically moved out to Rockville to across the country to like study this new approach, because and then it was like, okay, I'm going to spend a month on this video, right? And a month in, okay, I clearly am not done. There's a lot more, so let me spend another month on this. And I just kept, again, it took me 22 months, 671 days, over 2,000 hours. And the reason for that was because, one, it's so complex, there's so much going on, but two, is so interesting and powerful and applicable to so many things that I was like, oh my gosh, this is so going to be so good for people that I really need to do a very good job. And that's going to take a lot of work, but I think
100%.
It'll be worth it.
Yeah, and I think the culture and the world will be a better place because you've had that obsession. So thank you. I'm definitely inspired by the laser focus you have innately. There's something quite unique about that. I think not many people possess that ability to drive forward from a month to 22 months. It's a huge deal. I saw also in the video, actually, as an anecdote, you slept 6 months in a car park. It's San Fran. Like, that's something quite outside the realms of normal. What was that about?
So, do you know Johnny Sapinosa?
Yeah.
So he started teaching, when he started teaching movement classes in San Francisco, I was teaching in San Jose. So I wasn't sleeping there the whole time, but what I would do, he would have 7 a.m. morning classes after, I would teach until at least 9 p.m. the nights before. And so it really became like, if I drove home and then, that's another 30 minutes back home, and then it's going to be another hour to drive there in the morning, and then there's traffic, so I've got to go earlier. Like, I'm getting like 4 hours of sleep. So what it became after a while was, okay, I can train, I can stay up, I can teach class, train a little later, and then I'll drive up and just sleep in the parking lot.
Sleep in one car. And was the recovery any better than 4 hours sleep?
I mean, definitely. No, absolutely. Yeah, because I was able to get a lot more. As crazy as that sounds, I never made so much progress in my whole life. I was getting so good so fast. But
I
yeah,
have a similar thing about, I was in Australia for almost a year sleeping on Harry Williams' floor. And I similarly, like when you just soak up so much and it's just, yeah, of course, I'm doing nothing else. I'm just sleeping on this guy's floor and training all day. It's amazing. Of course, you have that obsessive like drive forward. So shout out Harry. I feel you, but it was maybe more comfortable than a car. Anyway, dude, thank you so much. Where can people find your work? Are you still teaching in person, or is it mainly online now?
mainly online now. But yeah, who knows? Who knows what the future holds? I think I'm doing another workshop in July in Baltimore, the ecological approach to contact improvisation. So that'll be really interesting.
Interesting. Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, so who knows? But
Awesome, man. Well, I'll keep an eye out, and I'm sure people will as well.
thank you. Yes, it
Dude,
was a great chat.
thank you so much, man. I fully enjoyed that. We'll do another one, I'm sure.
Yeah.